I just want to introduce Arup to you. I'm not sure how many people know Arup. Arup, with an employee-owned consultancy founded by our partner back in 1946. We've now got over 15,000 specialists working around the world in 35 countries. We have a corporate vision enshrined in our key speech that Ove Arup gave to the company as was back in 1972. And that corporate vision is to shape a better world. And from a water perspective, we now have a community of practice of 1,600 people working across the water cycle. And I just wanted to give a personal reflection. You just bear with me, but I think it's quite important. So back in March, I was fortunate enough to be at MIT in Boston. Within Arup, we run a master's class on urban resilience, and I was on that class. And we were being lectured by some very eminent urban planners and city designers as part of that course. And as part of that, we were looking at the historic collapse of civilizations due to environmental constraints. And this really challenged me. So in Arizona, in the area where Phoenix now sits, back in 1300, the Hohokam had created this thriving populace of 80,000 people, a canal network over 500 miles, with over 100,000 acres of cropland. Between 1300 and 1400, that civilization collapsed. And the archaeologists have looked at that in quite some detail, and that collapse they speculate is down to the presence of drought and intermittent flooding. So that was great, that was fascinating, I loved that. I went home and I logged on to the Guardian website, as I always do, and that's what I found. So some 700 years later, at the same location, we now have Phoenix struggling with water scarcity and some real issues around the sustainability of Phoenix as a city. And for me, that brings up a number of thoughts. One, I think these challenges are real, and if our time frame's large enough, they are indeed very real. And two, I think compared to back in 1300, we have at least got some foresight of what we think may come. There may be some uncertainty around that, and I think it's incumbent upon us to act, to do so. And then if we look ahead to the future, I popped in earlier on and there was some discussion around whether water should be at the centre of the SDGs. I don't mind if it isn't, but fundamentally, if you read the synthesis report, it says progress on SDG 6 will be impossible without progress in the other goals and vice versa. So it can sit anywhere. And more importantly, I think that the high-level panel on water in their publication earlier this summer really drilled down to some of those key interlinkages. So if our future is the SDGs, we've got to understand water in that context. So now I'm going to try something I haven't tried before. I'm going to take you through a publication we published this summer with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation on From Principles to Practice Towards a Circular Built Environment. And that publication explores how a built environment will operate differently if we start to adopt circular principles. And Arup have tried to translate the circular economy principles that we often see in products and services into a built environment context. So that's great. What I'm going to try and do is then explore that through a water lens in terms of what water may mean to that circular built environment. So there are 8 key themes that come through that publication. So the first is supporting human well-being and natural systems. So when we start to think about water, we need to start to think about human-centered design, community engagement, co-creation. Back in October last month in Tokyo, at the World Water Congress in Tokyo, we launched our Cities Alive publication, Water for People. That's the 5th in our series of publications, looking at cities across the globe and understanding where blue interventions have made real impact. And there are a number of themes coming from that are shown here. And clearly, in terms of this first issue around supporting human well-being, putting people first is a key message coming from our review of cities. In the bottom right-hand side there, you'll see a fairly complex diagram that hopefully you can read. So in the UK, we're working with Public Health England. We're starting to explore how can we get better health outcomes from infrastructure. So in the context of water, how can we get better health outcomes, whether it's from drainage and sanitation, whether it's from flood resilience projects, how can we get better health outcomes that benefits the city? And we're starting off from the hypothesis that generally we start to think about health too late in our design process. So we're bringing, with Public Health England, health right into the forefront of our scheme and solution optioneering process and starting to think about shared assets and shared outcomes. that's work that's ongoing, but we're looking forward to working with health agencies in designing infrastructure. It's quite exciting. The second key theme is guided by a systems thinking approach, which we've already heard a lot of today. And I want to use this prompt to talk about the work we've been doing with the Rockefeller Foundation, the Resilience Shift. So back in 2014, we set out with the Rockefeller Foundation to start to describe what city resilience looks like. What are the various characteristics of a city that might make one city more resilient to another? And on the back of that work, we developed the City Resilience Index, which is shown here, which started to tease out some of those key characteristics. And in doing that process, we came up with a proposition that actually water is a driver for solving some of these complex problems within the city, not just the water problems, but some of the wider problems around equality and vulnerability. So earlier on this year, working with the Rockefeller Foundation, with SIWI, and more recently with the OECD, we've been started to look at piloting that framework with a number of cities around the world. The idea of these pilots is to go to the cities, do a deep dive around the water governance and management issues in those cities, and start to reframe that City Resilience Index into a city water resilience framework. So over the last 6 months, we've been working with Mexico City, with Miami, with Hull, with Amman and Cape Town, all of which have got some fairly key and significant water challenges. If you listen to the representative from Miami speak, and she talks about Miami being at sea level rise, subject to 15-foot storm surges, subject to flood inundation from inland flooding, and subject to saline ingress into their groundwater supplies. Some fairly major water problems they're trying to get to grips with. So that's been ongoing for the last 6 months. We've got some Wave 2 cities now that we're starting to work with. And we've now started to take that thinking and build it into a city water resilience framework. It has links into the City Resilience Index, but it's subtly different in terms of understanding the role water plays around city resilience, looking at 4 dimensions around leadership and strategy, around planning and finance, around health and well-being, and around infrastructure and ecosystems. And within those key dimensions, there are a number of goals. I can share more of this with you later if you're interested. The next key theme in terms of our practices document is leverage by digital technology, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about digital today, and there are more eminent people than me to talk about blockchain and Internet of Things. But it is around accessible platforms, getting information out to citizens, enabling asset sharing and data across assets and new insights. And I wanted to share this bit of work, which I've been involved in. It's quite exciting. So as we move to more resilient basins, in terms of protecting our cities from flooding, we're looking at new ways of slowing the flow up in catchments. And we're looking at interventions around natural flood management. So how can we make small interventions in the catchment that when they aggregate themselves are quite large in terms of the impact they have on the flood curve. So we've been using remote sensing and artificial intelligence to identify the preferred locations for the natural flood management, which is interesting and exciting. The more exciting thing is, as we then get to a new asset model, which might have hard grey assets in cities and very dispersed natural assets in the catchments, how can we start to manage those as an asset base? And how can we use remote sensing machine learning to allow us to manage those assets more intelligently? The next key theme is holistic urban planning. This lies at the heart of what Arup does. Arup's involved in cities in all aspects. Designing for resilience, water as a catalyst, blue-green. You've probably heard a lot about this already this week. Top right-hand corner, this is Bradford. Anyone been to Bradford? One. So Bradford is quite a deprived community. It's got a number of challenges in terms of its economic development. Water was at the heart of regenerating the centre of that city. And the spin-off impacts around water in the city centre have been very marked and visible. Bottom right, working in New York, so trying to retrofit these solutions into an urban environment to try and mitigate the impact of storm overflows on the Hudson River. And the main photograph is of Leeds, and I know Gonzalo's knows Leeds. This is a really interesting project for us. This was a project that was being led by the Environment Agency in the UK. It had another consultant on board, not Arup, that was looking at the solution to manage flood risk in the city. That consultant was recommending that the city put in walls that were about 1.5 meters high through the center of the city. Technically it worked, but it would separated the city from the river entirely, and the whole public experience of the citizen in that city walking next to the river would have been lost. So Arup invested its own money and time in coming up with an alternative solution, which as of last year was built and is now installed. We put in a flexible weir, so under most circumstances that weir stays as is. When the flood comes down, the weir drops and the hydraulic curve through the rest of the city lowers, and our walls are only 0.5 meter high, not 1.5 meters high. I've been told I've got a minute left, so I'll quickly run through these. So the next bit of work I wanted to share with you around continuous material cycles is the work, again, we're doing with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and others on the water and the circular economy. So teasing out some key principles. The first principle being designing out waste externality. So how can we optimize water in catchments? And here I'm thinking about how we think about non-consumptive water use in catchments, how we think about water that's lost in terms of discharge to saline environments in catchments. And we explored this in some detail in our work with 2030 WRG, and I'd commend that to you. It's worth looking at. The second key principle is keeping resources in use, and this is perhaps what we are more familiar with in terms of the circular economy. It's starting to think about how we can optimize resource recovery in the water system. And again, we're doing some work in the UK with a water utility, starting to think about resource farming and land use planning for resource farming around wastewater treatment works. And in Australia, we'll be involved in sewer mining projects. We're actually mining the sewers for wastewater for reuse. And the third key principle is around regenerating natural capital, making sure we maintain those environmental flows in the catchments and we preserve and enhance the natural environment through maintaining fish passage, or increasingly through starting to think how we manage nutrients at source in the catchments. And there are some really interesting models around the world in terms of water funds associated with nutrients. Almost there. The next key theme is around designing for maintenance and deconstruction. I won't talk about the pavilion, I put it there because I like that image and it's an interesting story. But starting to think about how we can use new materials in our water cycle systems, biomaterials, how we can use those resources to generate biomaterials, this whole idea of the urban bioloop. And then thinking about flexible and productive buildings where we harvest rainwater and reuse stormwater. And then thinking fully about our integrated infrastructure systems, integrating water, energy and waste. And thinking about intelligent systems. So the image on the bottom left there is some work we've been doing in UK on intelligent sewers. So using the sewers intelligently to capture and store water to save capital works on storage. And lastly, starting to think about the full value of water. I've put this one in. It wasn't our original work for Ellen MacArthur, but I think this is imperative around creating opportunities to think about water and resilience in a different way. And this whole idea of shared value, I think, is quite interesting. So to conclude, I think a lot of the messages we heard before, water provides a pathway for future urban resilience. Water is integral to a future circular economy within the built environment. Traditional approaches on their own will not be sufficient, and this opportunity for step change, whether it's green, blue, dispersed, local, smart. And finally, I think we've already heard today from the previous speakers, the need to do things differently, and these messages are taken from the high-level panel on water around better data, around understanding value, around better governance, and around thinking basin-wide. Thank you.
Gracias.